Great. Welcome everyone to today's special Sihasin hour. This is part of our series that's focused on the helium development that has been proposed for kind of like the Four Corners area, I suppose you could say, Sanasti, Tisnaspas area. And we're so happy today to have Professor Kurt Jalbert with us from ASU. As well as Elaine Shimono, who comes with so much water expertise. And I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves. Actually, you all know me, Executive Director here at Yeha Nido, which does business as Navajo and Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund. But I will go ahead and turn this over to our speakers to introduce themselves, and then we'll start out with our presentations. So Professor Jalbert, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kurt Jalbert, and I'm a professor here at Arizona State University. I'm the director of a lab called the Civic Science for Environmental Futures Lab, and we're a group of faculty and students that use community-based participatory research and other kinds of methods to be able to help communities build more just environmental futures with a large focus on energy issues and extraction related issues. And we've been studying helium extraction in the Four Corners, or I should say the Colorado Plateau region since about 2018.
Hello.
Yes, Elaine, please introduce yourself.
Okay. Thank you for having me today. I live on unceded Tiwa land in the Albuquerque area. My name is Elaine Shimono. I am the director for Common Ground Rising. I have worked on water issues for the last 30 years in New Mexico. And including the sole source aquifer designation for the Espanola Basin, which granted groundwater as drinking water back in 2007. So some of my expertise comes from working in coalitions with people on what water contamination looked like throughout that region. That was 3,000 square miles of northern New Mexico. So thank you very much for having me today.
Absolutely. Well, we're so excited to have you and to hear you talk about water impacts of a proposal such as this. But we'll get started with just kind of the general broad discussion on environmental impacts with Professor Jalbert. And Professor, I understand you have a presentation that you'd like to share. So go ahead and let me know if there's anything we can do to help you get that up.
Do this, and then I'll do this. Tab 2.
And many of you were here during the last presentation that Professor Jalbert provided. And so he's going to be able to dive into some of those impacts more extensively. I think we had 10 minutes to
Okay.
an overview last time, and yeah, it was inadequate. So thank you for being available more extensively.
Can you see my slides now? Okay, good. So before I get started on today's main topic, I thought we might just pull back for a few minutes and talk a little bit about some of the economic and regulatory shifts in the helium industry that have really precipitated this recent boom in helium extraction that the Four Corners region is implicated in. And the reason I thought this might be important is because I think it helps to frame how Navajo concerns about helium extraction don't exist in a vacuum, but are also concerns of other communities that are experiencing this boom. For instance, as I just noted, I mean, I've been working on extraction-related issues for almost 15 years now, but since 2018, a lot of my work has been in the Holbrook Basin area of Arizona, but we're learning about how communities in Utah and Kansas and Colorado and elsewhere are also having the same kinds of questions about their entanglements with the helium extraction boom. So just to get started here, the federal government has maintained like near complete control over the US helium market for almost a century. And this has been due to its strategic, economic, and military uses during the World War I era of airships, and then eventually the Cold War space race. And in 1920, there was something called the Mineral Leasing Act that actually excluded private industry from extracting helium from federal lands for almost half a century without the authority of this going directly into a federal repository. And this was established in 1929 called the Federal Helium Reserve. But growing demand from commercial sectors, particularly from the electronics and industrial manufacturing industries in the 70s and 80s, started to really change all of this. And so to promote more helium supply, Congress passed what's known as the Helium Privatization Act in 1996, and then the Helium Stewardship Act in 2013, which freed government agencies to purchase helium from private producers. And these acts also set in motion plans to close the Federal Helium Reserve. And originally it was supposed to be in like 2020 and then 2021. And then because of COVID, it's been extended to September of this year. But they're slowly selling off all these reserves. Now, what does this mean? Well, at the same time that privatization plan has been put in place, global helium shortages have really expedited these privatization plans. There's been a number of global supply disruptions in like sequential years, the most recent one being as a result of the war with Ukraine, and Russia's a large producer of helium, and that's come off the sort of global market. And just, for some context, helium is used for industrial gas, for microchip manufacturing, for MRIs, and superconductor cooling, and all these different industries are like on super growth trajectories, right? And so that's why like everybody's scrambling for helium right now. And at the same time, helium in the United States and elsewhere has historically been recovered as a byproduct of conventional natural gas extraction. But shale gas, which now accounts for the overwhelming majority of natural gas production in the US, has no helium because helium molecules are so small that they actually escape from shale formations. And so now that we're largely not using conventional gas extraction for natural gas, helium supplies are the ways in which we used to get helium are starting to dry up. And so what this has caused is this big push, because helium prices are sky high and we're not getting it from traditional supplies, for drilling companies to like go and seek helium specific formations so that they can go and get helium. Here we are. So these prospects of helium shortages ultimately resulted in the Department of Interior in 2018 listing helium as a critical mineral. And this is significant because it then allowed for other kinds of federal interventions. And one of the more important ones was in 2019, there was the new Conservation Management Act that changed the way that federal leasing terms happen around oil and gas, and that these permits were only considered financially viable for hydrocarbons, but now they can be considered financially viable if they produce helium as well, which allows them to hang on to these leases long term. So why does this matter? Well, that is just one piece of the larger puzzle that have caused gas extraction companies to start prospecting for new helium on public and private and tribal lands, particularly throughout the Colorado Plateau, which has been known to have historically rich helium deposits. And here's just a few on this map. Okay, so there you have it. That's kind of how we got to where we are now. And now I want to turn to sort of what this rush for helium resources is doing and how it's playing out in these areas that we're concerned about today. So much of what I'll cover in my remaining slides are taken directly from the environmental impact statement produced by the Navajo Nation Oil and Gas Company for review by the Department of Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs. And just to kind of outline these three locations, here we see the map for the Porcupine Dome. There's 83 proposed well pads at this time in this area, and these are going to be drilled at depths of about 6,000 feet. And this is for helium, but also there is historically oil and methane in these formations. And so it would not just be for the production of helium. In the Beautiful Mountain or Big Gap area, we see presently a proposal for 53 wells at depths of 3,500 to 5,200 feet. And this is for oil and methane, and as well as helium, but oil and methane are some of the larger components of those wells presently. And then the Tehachapi Wash area, we have 64 current proposed wells on these permits. And this would be for a depth of about 3,000 to 5,000 feet for oil, methane, helium, and condensate. And condensate are things that are other kinds of hydrocarbons like propane and methane. All right, those matter. Take note of those condensates. So let's step back and talk about land impacts. So one thing that I want to emphasize is that it's really important to understand not just what happens at the wellhead, but also the sort of total process of extraction. And I noted this in my prior talk. So I want to first of all talk about the difference here between horizontal and vertical wells, or conventional and unconventional wells. On the right, you see what's a vertical well, and this is conventional drilling, in which you have a drill hole that is brought down vertically. And what's being used in a lot of the helium industry right now is what's called acid jet fracturing, or acid injection, in which the acid is injected into these formations that are largely limestone and sandstone, and it sort of eats away at those formations, and then the helium gas comes up. And this is largely what we're seeing as being proposed. But the thing that I thought was really interesting, and I have had my suspicions around this, and it's really spelled out in the impact statement, and I'm going to quote directly here, that directional drilling meaning horizontal drilling, may be used on the acreage due to the terrain, houses, and development needs, and horizontal drilling can expose more of a reservoir and could expose hundreds of thousands of feet of new pay zone meaning more helium deposits. So why does this matter? Well, let's talk about this. First, from a land disturbances perspective, right? You've probably already seen in these areas, and may continue to see, seismic testing. This is when you see thumper trucks and other kinds of mechanisms to be able to identify helium deposits, and those have their own sort of land impacts associated with those. And then you have well pad sites, pipelines, and access roads. So let's talk about just the pads themselves. So the counter proposal says that these are going to be about 2¼ acres per pad, per well pad, which is, you can see in the top right here, that would be a conventional well pad, about 2½ acres. This is in the Holbrook Basin area. But the acreage and number of wellheads per pad may increase significantly if there's helium drilling that is using horizontal drilling operations, and these can go 5 to 7 or more acres, right? That's just the physical footprint of the well pad. And now let's talk about what actually happens on those sites. Well, when you have conventional drilling, they're estimating, say, 25 trucks per day per wellhead during drilling phases, 24/7 for about a month, and then they say 2 trucks per day during production, which is when the helium is sort of coming up. I would suggest that this is a conservative estimate, and it would definitely go up as unconventional drilling techniques being used, because there's a lot of water that needs to get trucked in for that, and there's a lot of produced water or wastewater that needs to be dealt with on the other end of that. And there's a lot more rigs, which would mean more diesel generators and pumps, which have their own sort of air quality implications, noise quality implications and impacts. So let's talk a little bit about what happens with the waste. Well, reserve pits are where these produced fluids are proposed to be sort of dumped into. So water, this sort of produced fluid comes up from the well pad after it's used, and then it's dumped into you can just barely see it on the left-hand side, the right-hand side of that bottom right image. This is a unconventional well pad that's in the Northeast, but just on the right-hand side, you can see how there's kind of a road, and I didn't include in the picture, but there's a big holding pond there, and that's where they would sort of spill out all these fluids. Usually what happens is the plan is this stuff just gets evaporated, just evaporates. And so if there's any other kinds of contaminants that are in that, and we'll talk about some of these in a moment, that's also getting evaporated, and that's an air quality issue. But within the permits, we also see that they propose that if not used in a lined pit, then there'll be holding tanks on site, and then it'll be trucked off site. And usually this ends up going to things like high pressure injection wells in other parts of the state and region. So I talked about condensate, right? We'll talk here in just a moment about pipelines, but it seems as though there are plans in place to try, and if there's oil and methane or natural gas to try and bring this to places to be processed and then sent off to market, right? But there does not seem to be plans in place for condensate. And what that means is these are kind of like residual gases that they're not sure what the heck they're going to do with. And frequently they get stripped off on site and burned on site. And this is flaring, or the flaring stacks that you frequently see on well pads that have their own pollution issues. In addition to all this, you also have noise, dust, dust particles, emissions, from vehicles. These are what are called sour gas and wet gas regions. So you may also have hydrogen sulfide and sulfur dioxide and other things that are coming up. Okay, moving along here. Let's talk about the pipeline networks. These are 3 maps that are within the impact assessments. And Elaine pointed out, maybe you could talk about this when you get to your phase, Elaine, that these are, you consider these incomplete, or that they didn't necessarily account for all the pipelines in that area, and it might be worth talking about. These are what are called gathering pipelines. They're about 6 inches. They're considered temporary within the sort of pipeline permitting world, but temporary doesn't necessarily mean that they come and go. They could be there for a long time. They're just permitted differently, and they actually tend to be permitted with less restrictions and less safety protocols. That's changed a little bit. There's some new federal standards around gathering pipelines at the federal level. Now, the proposal is saying that crude oil is going to be sent via a pipeline to a tank farm, and then methane is going to be sent to a 12-inch tribal utility authority pipeline just north of the fields. And you can see this in the Porcupine and Beautiful Mountain. They have kind of an offshoot pipeline that's going to go off to a presently inactive pipeline that's going to have to be put back into operation. 12-inch gas pipeline is not minor. That's going to have its own implications in terms of safety issues of reactivating a line of that size. And then the helium is likely going to get sent off to either a helium plant that's over in the DBK field in Arizona, or noted on that previous map where all this other kind of large processing facilities infrastructure is, it's over in the Oklahoma, Texas area. It may get sent that way as well. And so helium is going to get kind of dispersed off to where there's processing capacity. So let's talk about some habitat related issues. These are just a few tables that I pulled out of the permit applications that actually show that there's a fair number of native, rare, threatened species, both plant and animal species in this area. And this doesn't even necessarily account for sensitive ecosystems, right? I mean, I think that when we talk about ecological impacts, we can't just say, is there or is there not borrowing hours that we need to account for, but also what are the habitat disturbances that may occur that are going to make it such that it's more difficult for threatened and endangered species to be able to continue to thrive in these areas, right? So we need to have that holistic picture. And then I want to get on to just 2 more slides here, and then we'll pass on to Elaine related to water issues. So surface and subsurface water issues. For conventional drilling, the permits, and I would say this is probably about right, they're estimating about 1 barrel of water is needed for each foot of well depth. So 6,000 foot well would need about 6,000, I'd say probably 6,000 to 8,000 barrels of water. But we also need to account for drilling muds and hydrochloric acid that would be used in the acid injection. And then, this is just for the first stimulation process. Often wells are re-stimulated at future dates when production drops. And so it would be, again, sort of a reiteration of that. And then these numbers would greatly increase by orders of magnitude if unconventional drilling were used. Now, operators, they will show these very sort of clean diagrams of how they try and case or seal off groundwater and aquifers using cement casings. But there's a lot of evidence out there in the peer-reviewed academic literature that suggests that this is not always effective. Cement cracks. There's a lot of well casing failures that exist out there and documented evidence. Also, this sort of narrative does not account for all of the existing fractures that already exist underground from formation to formation, particularly with karst limestone formations. So it's worth noting that on average, like maybe a third of fluids that tend to go down into a well pad are actually recovered back up to the surface. This is really important, given that we're learning with acid injection, if it's just water in this small percentage of acid, a lot of that acid gets neutralized by the existing formations because of the pH differences. But that may be all well and good, but what we're learning is that the helium industry is also borrowing a lot of methods learned from the hydraulic fracturing industry, even in conventional drilling operations, to be able to use more aggressive stimulation techniques. And a lot of other kinds of additives are being brought into this process. So it may be hard to kind of read this table, but just this is from a table in one permit application from an Arizona operator, in which we see listed here things like quite toxic things like naphthalene, trimethylbenzene, ethylene glycol, that are some of the items of highest concern when you see people talking about health issues related to water in the hydraulic fracturing industry. And then again, like I said, these are either going to be evaporated or sent elsewhere. And just as you can see, there's a number of important aquifers that are present in the region. That map on the right, particularly the Mesa Verde and Dakota aquifers, which are at depths that are proximal to, very closely proximal, if not actually in the areas that are proposed to be drilling at depths in the Porcupine, Big Gap, and Tehachapi areas. So with that, I'm going to send it over to Elaine, who I think has some really nice stuff lined up for us, and happy to answer questions when we move to that phase of the talk.
Great. Thanks so much, Professor Dalbert. Thank you, Elaine.
Hi, I'm going to share my screen now, and let's see, share. Here we go. I'm going to pass on, get some of this here. So what we did when we first came, this was first brought up, is of course look at the EA, and we went to the let's see if I can bring this up. New Mexico Tech mapping, and we found that when we put in helium, that there was only a small resource down in this area, which would be the Porcupine area, and up in the northwest corner. We didn't show any of the other, this is all coal, all the white area here is gas. So the state of New Mexico is, at Mexico Tech, is only showing a certain amount of helium in the area, which leads us to believe that it's mostly going to be natural gas that is going to be mined out of this area. According to this assessment, the environmental assessment, there will be over 10 well pads, 100 feet of residents, businesses, and chapter houses. And this is very significant on what the environmental impacts are going to be to the people in the San Ostis chapter. In the two Gray Hills and Tehachapi chapters, these areas show there's going to be at least 22 wells in this area, and it shows no residents, it shows no businesses in this area, and we don't know if that's correct or not. There may be many people living in this area that will be impacted. There may be people running sheep, cattle in this area. One of the things that was brought up is that in the area here, it shows springs. And if you look, there's almost 10 wells around those springs. So we expect that there's going to be some runoff and impact to the springs in this area. Of course, this EA in this specific region shows no significant impact, which we feel like this is more of a boilerplate EA that was given in many of these areas. In the Technopos area as well, This is the area here that has that shows more of the high school, the city area, where the chapter house is, where the drinking water wells are. And of course, there's all about 10 or 15 pads just in this area. They expect to do 60 wellheads up in this chapter area. And each of these squares are 1 square mile. So if you have several wells within a square mile, you have a major impact from not only water, but air, land use. All of that is, they plan on putting injection wells in this area that are known to cause earthquakes. And they also have a reserve for open pits. And these open pits can break, they can run over. These gathering lines can leak. They leak emissions as well as fluids. And there's been other accidents. So if you go or you have visited any of these sites, you will see what the impacts are in these areas. So the impact of extraction, there's a growing amount of evidence that shows that hydraulic gas fracking and helium extraction is harmful, not only to the local environment, but the global climate and human health. And there's also social economic issues that this type of fracking, this hydraulic drilling, cannot be done safely. There's emerging evidence that suggests that earthquakes can continue to rise for years after waste has been injected and cannot be prevented through proper fracking protocols or by limiting the rate or volume of injection. Injecting fracking waste into shallower zones is one method of reducing earthquakes, but then that causes water contamination. There was nothing in the EA that shows where they're going to put those injection wells, and there was nowhere in these EAs or on these maps that showed where they were going to put these open pits. And usually these open pits are that cause a lot of damage. Associated with air pollution, this is really a real grave concern because of the condensed location of these wells to some of the residents and businesses in the areas where they planned to do this extraction. The research has shown that and documented in the Compendium 7, which holds about over 2,000 peer-reviewed studies on the impacts of hydraulic drilling. And they have documented 200 different air pollution near and drilling operations. There are 61 classified hazardous pollutants known to affect health risks, and 26 are endocrine disruptors. There's substantial impacts from ground level ozone, striking declines in air quality, and in several cases, increased risks of health problems with known links to air pollution. Air sampling surveys find high concentrations of fine particulates, organic compounds, VOCs, volatile organic compounds, especially carcinogens that come from benzenes and formaldehyde. Both are at the wellhead and at distances that exceed the legal setbacks from the wellheads to residents. Some cases, VOC concentrates exceed federal safety standards in several magnitudes of order. Around the United States and in Colorado, they have documented air pollution increased from these drilling operations with increased rates of cancer, exposures to emissions from flaring, diesel exhaust. They have averaged 4,000 to 6,000 trips per wellhead, and has posed severe respiratory health risk of those living near drilling operations. And in the United States, leads the world in flaring stacks. So these air pollutions and flaring operations from VOCs, aromatic hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, heavy metals, and formaldehyde. So what happens is that these spills and intentional discharges from fracking waste onto the surface have profoundly altered the chemistry and ecologies of streams throughout the areas of the watersheds and downstream levels of radioactive elements that are also included in the hydraulic fracking drilling process. That it also includes heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, toxins, toxic disinfectant byproducts, acidity, decreasing aquatic biodiversity, populations of zooplankton, sensitive fish species, trout, all of it's affected, and also the bacterial floral of the groundwater is also represented as an emerging area concern in fracking operations. The demand for water use in US fracking operations continues to rise, as more than doubled from 2016. And unlike water use for agriculture and industrial uses, the water used for fracking remains in the shale bedrock and is permanently lost to the hydrological cycle. This is very important because what it does is disappears water, and it causes more water scarcity. And at a time when we are facing severe climate crisis, it makes the idea of using this type of fracking and drilling it should be out of the question for continued use. There's no way of doing fracking safely, and no regulations stop water contamination. It doesn't stop airborne chemicals. It doesn't stop the waste and there's no way of stopping earthquakes once they inject, and these earthquakes rise years after the waste has been injected. There's no protocol that can be raised, and it has very significant health impacts to the surrounding area. New studies show that that fracking can deplete streams and aquifers in ways that contribute to water stress and water scarcity. And a 2018 study of water use for fracking operations increased by 770% between 2011 and 2016 across all US shale basins. At the same time, the volume of fracking wastewater generated in the first year was up 1,440%. So you get 2 to 3 times more fracking waste water than you do with the actual water that was used. And fresh water should never be used in these type of operations. And that really wasn't addressed in the EA as well. There's no no known solution for the problem of fracking wastewater. It can't be filtered, it can't be cleaned, or it can't be drinkable, and there's no real safe disposal method. They haven't dealt with the issue of radioactivity in this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The recycling that they're trying to do down in the southern part of the state is limited. The options is expensive, and the increased radionuclide levels of subsequent groundwater really isn't tracked in New Mexico. In several other states, we have tracking of radionuclides from fracking wastewater. They use some of this wastewater recycled, they use for roads. To hold down dust, and sometimes during this winter months put in as a de-icer on roads. This has caused a lot of spread of radionuclides off the oil field and into the private communities. And this is the radionuclides are exempt on the oil field as part of the act that was initiated back in 2005. And so, but it's not off the field, but there is no tracking of it from what we see in the Navajo Nation on the EA, has not addressed it. And it is not addressed in the state of New Mexico at all. They've tried to exempt it. The problem is that many of these agencies are underfunded, and so they don't have the monitoring capability or the ability to enforce any of the laws that are around it. And so these underground formations that receive fracking wastewater via an injection well into a disposal well, of course, have been linked. Now, I want to talk a little bit about pipelines and compressor stations, because both of this is part of what is being mentioned in the EA, and these are also significant sources of air pollution, and in the form of benzene and formaldehyde, and these cause potential health risk, and they offer no economic benefit. Instead, they're associated with the loss of tax revenue, economic development for communities where they're sited. In 2017, there was a significant study done where 70 different air pollutions in compressor station emissions were studied. Were found in that study. And then in 2019, the study found that 39 of the chemicals released are linked to cancer. And in a 2020 study found that these found the proximity to higher amounts of volatile emissions from compressor stations were linked to higher death rates. There has been really no other placement on these maps within the EA that are showing where these compressor stations are going to be, where these open pits are going to be. There's a myriad of other health impacts that we'll talk about. And of course, there is the cultural impact. And I want to go to the next slide. Most of this information is found in the compendiment of scientific and medical media findings demonstrated risk and harms of unconventional gas and oil extraction. This again has over 2,000 peer-reviewed studies, and it's very important. It's a very important document because when we first started dealing with fracking issues, when we were faced in our communities in the Rio Grande Valley, there was not a lot of information out there. And now all of this information has been put into one area, and it covers not only New Mexico, Colorado, California, and up in the Northeast from Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York. A lot of these places have banned fracking, and a lot of them are in the process of doing that. I want to draw your attention here. This is what an open pit looks like. And recently, in Carlsbad, New Mexico, over 420,000 gallons were spilled onto a private property. And this is the property of Devon Energy, that these containers collapsed because the acids and the corrosion of these chemicals just waste away these, and they burst. And they burst in a matter of months or years. I would say that one brine well that we have 7 miles west of Rio Rancho, that brine well is so corrosive coming out of the ground. That's without any fracking. This was a natural brine coming out of highly corrosive chlorides and different radioactive elements that have burst 4 times since 2009. And we have dealt with they put these evaporation ponds out there for just the brine, and that condensed into T-norm, highly radioactive salts. And those salts were then dumped into our municipal landfill. So a lot of the issues that go on the oil field, like these oil pits and these spills that are happening, end up in local landfills that then illegally, a lot of times, are then pollute the groundwater around those fields. And in the case of Rio Rancho, we have our municipal wells that could be impacted by this. So drilling activities, how they're disposing, how they carry the produced water off the field, where they, all the spills that were that are reported. Just this year, in the first 6 weeks, in the state of New Mexico, there were over 869 produced water spills in the first 6 weeks of 2022. This is outrageous amount of spills. But the issue is that these spills are not illegal. It's only illegal if they don't report the spill. And so we don't have a lot of the regulation that really protects people from these types of operations. And so a lot of the contamination to water comes from the dirty operation of the business. If you, the cement casings that go down through the aquifer that are supposed to protect the aquifer, well, we all know that cement breaks up after a while. They had cement casings in that brine well east of us, and it's all corroded. And so these issues are very significant. And here again, it's just an inherent engineering problem over time that really hasn't been addressed. So the act of fracking itself can redistribute stress and open underground pathways for fluid to migrate, and which in turn can communicate other pathways created during the fracking of neighboring wells by the deterioration of cement in aging wells and casings, or by earthquakes, leading in all cases to a risk of groundwater contamination and atmospheric risk. The problem of leaking wells, first identified by the industry, has no new known solution. And the T-norm has really not been addressed. So you have workers that are hauling produced water off of these sites, and they're being contaminated. They breathe this in. So these workers are known to have respiratory issues. This can cause lung cancer. But not only that, but these particles are on their clothes. So the worker goes home, they take off their clothes, maybe in the garage, and they put it in the washing machine and wash it. They might shower differently. But then what happens is that they're contaminating their families. They wash the family clothes in that washer. That radiation doesn't go away. And that radiation spreads throughout the community. And it's really not being addressed. So we come to kind of a lack of response from responsible agencies. We have a lot of groups within the Navajo Nation, the NACARE, the Chaco Coalition, many coalitions within Red Valley, who have been working on these issues, and they put together a report which is in the information that you were talking about last week about what do they suggest? What are some of the problems that many of these groups are facing, just as the people in these chapters that are going to be dealing with this new helium extraction? And some of that was a lack of access to information. They don't know what the original lease are. They don't know what those modifications are. They don't have the infrastructure permits attached to the EA. There's no right-of-ways that have been put into this EA. They haven't dealt with the contracts for road work and maintenance. And there has been no studies for water and air issues. So there hasn't been these baseline studies now to know what those impacts, those cumulative impacts are going to be on these communities. And so there has not been in Red Valley a responding to the complaints of the existing helium wells that are there. So you already have a practice and pattern going on with NOG on these areas, excuse me, in Red Valley. And so because there's inadequate community information out there, you need another window for for bringing this information to the community, an extended time so people understand when the meeting's going to be and what, and that they're notified through either website posting or stakeholder contact lists are very important in getting the word out for meetings. And that's been one of the issues that many of these many of these groups has faced. Another issue that has come up that I've heard over and over again from various groups is that many people on the Navajo Council members are also stakeholders in Navajo oil and gas, and they're benefiting personally from the tribal's financial investment. And this really results in the inability for tribal members or any member of society for not being heard and not having their issues redressed and action on what they have recommended. So when you have these potential conflicts of interest between a board member and a company, and you have conflicts that arise between a company and the society, because that company is acting in its own interest at the expense of the society, you have a major issue that you have to deal with. And we not only see this on the Navajo Nation, but we also see it in our state government. We have that issue with the governor, with campaign donations, and we have to deal with these leaders being captured by these interests. So it's not just what is going on here, but it is influencing about how people are getting their issues addressed. Now, I compiled this information from a report that was done by it's a Red Valley report by Sonia Grant, a PhD, and Danae Kerr. And they outlined these, and this is in the information that is on the website that you can download, the 805 pages, that all this information is available to the council members to read. This isn't, but a lot of the public doesn't know what many of these groups have done and what they've been doing for the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years, trying to outline some of the issues that they have faced and in continuing errors in leaseholds, in permits, in violations of environmental law, the lack of transparency, the proper notification. These are things that continue to happen. And one of the things that I want to bring up that you might have saw on a past slide was the cultural impacts. And I think that Navajo people can speak more strongly and more definite than I can on exactly the cultural. I would say that the historical preservation aspect of the EA was very good, but the EA ignored it basically, and with their findings of no significant impact, because when you come down to it, cultural rights are human rights. Water is a human right. Breathing clean air is a human right. And cultural rights and these human rights are wrapped up in self-determination. And there was a a finding by the Navajo Supreme Court that addressed the lack of response in addressing issues, and that makes it really difficult to hold regulators and operators accountable for their pollution and their environmental degradation. And what has happened elsewhere on the Navajo Nation and in the East Agency had happened in Red Valley as well. And what they found is that, and in their opinion that was addressed, that they really needed to deal with the jurisdictional issues and the issues of self-interest and what equitable business leases were in that finding. And they found that it would impact self-determination over the long term. I think it would be wise to have an attorney speak to these issues in an upcoming.
Great, thanks so much, Elaine. That's a lot of information. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I don't think we have any questions from the viewers at this time. We do have some folks who said,
I'm sorry I went over. I was trying to give you a lot of information there, but I could make this available to people so that they could read it.
Okay, certainly. If we get any requests in the chat, we'll definitely let you know. I was interested in those maps that Kurt was showing earlier. I guess I'm struggling to have a sense for how these different sites align with respect to each other. I kind of wish I had like one map that showed all of them in their proximity.
I was thinking of doing I was thinking the same thing when I was putting that together last night. We're seeing them in these atomized ways. It would be nice to see them all aligned, and on top of that, see them aligned with the other sort of present historical and sort of proposed helium fields that are starting to emerge across the region. You know, I mean, I know that if you look at, say, you know, Mexico Tex maps about where helium is, I mean, those are based on like really general information. But if you look at where, you have to look at where they have found residual helium in wells in the past, or have drilled helium wells in the 1960s, for instance, to really get a good sense as to where they think helium may be. And that's the more kind of prospective version of the helium map. And it would be nice to see all that in one place.
Yeah, I mean, especially there were two of the sites in New Mexico that they actually may be adjacent to each other. When I was looking, you had all three maps up at the same time, and it was like, I was trying to place those geographically, and it looks like they may be touching even. I thought that was strange. It's something I want to look into for sure.
I have the capacity to do that here. Wait till the end of the semester, and then I can probably help you produce that.
Cool. Yeah, that's really interesting. And then the information that Elaine was showing, like when I was looking through some of those maps for the sites earlier, you know, seeing like the Tisnas Pass site, I was so blown away. Like the entire community of Tisnas Pass is located within the development site, which seemed surprising, if not shocking. And then even Sanasti, some of the maps I was looking at, it looked like that the community itself was also included within some of the development zones. And I'm not sure that people understand that.
I would say that this really needs an environmental impact statement, that we need a much more than a finding of no significant impact. This will have devastating impact on the health of the people in these communities. And to see that, it would be criminal, I believe, to allow this project to go through without addressing the issues. It's really hard to give this information and not be so alarmed by what these impacts mean to the community, not only to the people living there, but to also our water, our air, what grows, the birds, the trees, everything. And one thing that we know that there's heavy drought in the area, and we're going to get more of that. And I was very concerned about Beautiful Mountain and the reservoir that's up there, Big Gap, and what was going to happen to that reservoir as well. So there were a lot of other questions that I had about water contamination up there that I couldn't answer because it wasn't in the EA. And so it just created more questions, and there weren't answers. And in an environmental impact statement, you would get that. So I think that's one of the things that people should ask for.
Yeah, and I don't know if there was much discussion about the geology, but I'd be curious to know that. Is this a geologically stable area? Or
I think that having a geologist, a hydrologist talk about this, I could talk about what those impacts are, but they did not have the science in this EA that would answer those questions. So I was a little bit limited on, talking about other than talking about what the surface impacts would be from hydraulic drilling. And it's hydraulic drilling, and it's doesn't really make a difference whether it's going to be gas or any of these other helium or any of the other noble gases that they want to extract out of this. There's a same process that's going on.
Elaine, I need to contradict you on that, and I'm sorry, because I really can't let that sit without correcting it. That is not accurate, and I want to make sure that we sort of say this in the public venue. We need to be very careful when we're paying attention to the helium extraction industry, and this is something that I've spent the past 4 years really trying to thoroughly understand, because this is a fairly new industry, specific helium drilling, and there's a lot of confusion that's floating around related to hydraulic fracturing, and I think that we need to understand that is not, we can't make that mapping one-to-one onto this industry. And I say that with high confidence, and that having reviewed a lot of documents. And, so for instance, when we talk about radionuclides, and this is having spent a decade studying the shale gas industry, when we talk about things like radionuclides, that pertains to the shale gas industry because shale formations inherently have radionuclides in that formation. And so when the produced waters come up to the surface, those radionuclides become T norms at the surface. But with helium extraction, those are not going into shale formations. They're going into the limestone and sandstone formations where radionuclides are not present, unless there are things like,
uranium,
co-present uranium, right? And unless we actually know that, I feel very uncomfortable making the one-to-one mapping of hydraulic fracturing over. And in terms of it being on worker clothing, and I mean, I'm not dismissing all of the very detrimental and harmful histories of uranium mining on the Navajo Nation. I'm very aware of all of that. But the reason why I say it's important to make these distinctions is because I'm seeing advocacy networks in other parts of the country that are making this one-to-one mapping, and it's causing a lot of harm in terms of, yes, it may bring a lot of attention to the problem, but then when you go and start negotiating with operators and regulators and other people, it's inaccurate, and it's causing a lot of problems in ways that I'm trying to correct for. And this is why I was really careful in the first half of my presentation to say, a lot of what we're seeing in the helium industry is vertical acid matrix, processes and discussions of the possibility of doing horizontal drilling as well. But there's also separations between horizontal and high volume hydraulic fracturing that need distinctions because they are not one and the same. Horizontal drilling means that you can do horizontal bit movement, but you may
And
still
they've
use
left
acid jet
themselves
mason.
open in these EAs to do that. And
I have, yes,
that has not
right.
been dealt with. And so that's why this EA is for having a no significant finding is not enough. And
I agree with you 100%, but I think I want to make sure that we understand and we're very clear for the public so that they understand that we need to take the position of we just don't know yet. But I think that it's dangerous for us to go straight to the direction of it. So therefore you need to go see everything that's happening in the shale gas industry, all those, all those parallel impacts and everything, because that doesn't put us in the right place.
If the mapping from New Mexico Tech is not showing helium in that area, and it shows a lot of gas, and they're opening themselves up to doing hydraulic drilling, then it seems that likely that that's what they're going to be doing.
I actually want to contest that too, because a number of these wells that they're going to be going into these fields for are existing oil wells and natural gas wells that are no longer producing wells. And so
are they
but they're
stripping?
because they're becoming viable for helium, which until recently has not been a price point where it's viable. On top of that, I can share with you a doctoral dissertation that came out of Colorado School of Mines a year ago, in which they went around and tested all of the wells in the region to, in many ways, basically prove what a lot of folks have been sort of assuming, that there is helium in these areas and has been for a long time. And they've recovered helium in these well sites for a long time, but they were never the target gas. And at that map that I showed actually from the U.S. Geological Survey shows the fact that these helium reserves have been known for some time, but there has not been. And this is why I started my presentation by saying that there's a lot of motivation for the private sector to go off and start to privatize helium extraction. And in doing so, they're looking at all of these old maps. They're looking at all of these old drilling logs to say, where has helium been found? And so I guess what I'm saying is I would not take the New Mexico Tech map as gospel, because that is an impartial map based on all sorts of other resources that I've had at my disposal.
Okay, well, we are at time. I really found the photographs helpful to kind of get a sense for what this development could look like. And I wish we could have a photograph of a fully developed site with like similar acreage and similar well pads. I don't know if a site like that exists, but that was really helpful to kind of understand what this is going to look like. So I appreciate that and all of the information you guys put together. It's quite a few well pads actually, and I appreciate the distinction that each well pad can have more than one well on it. And I wish we had more time to talk about things like, for example, I want to know what a compressor pad is. And anyway, because that's also authorized for a couple of the sites. But again, there's so much information, and I think this is demonstrative of the point that you guys have been making.
Yeah, and there's a lot of impacts from all of that, whatever they're doing. And a lot of times they bring out a lot more than what, it could be helium, gas, oil. There's a lot of things that they could be extracting. So all of those are going to have those impacts.
Well, thank you both so much. And I appreciate you putting a lot of information into a small period of time.
Yeah.
And for your care in going through the documents and thinking through all of this. And it's really, really helpful because, this legislation is over 800 pages long. It's a lot of information for the public.
Yeah, it is.
Digest. Yeah. So thank you for bringing your technical expertise to the table and helping us navigate through all of this material. So
okay.
Thank you for having me.
Yes,
thank you.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.